A few weeks ago, I took the longest road trip of my life. Me and Kevin Williams drove 16 hours over the course of 2 days from Fort Worth to the Chicago area so that we could attend Vintage Computer Festival Midwest. VCF is one of the largest meetups of computer fans, and unlike gaming conventions, this meetup is all about the computers of the past. It's also a place for me to meet up with fans, sell some of my games, and sign some autographs. I also brought the Commander X16 prototype with me so that people could check it out in person. Crazy Ken from Computer Fan was there showing off some of his rare Apple systems, and Clint from LGR was there with some of his gear including the Woodgrain 486. In fact, all three of us did a panel together with Jim Leonard, which I'll be putting a link to that in the description field. But you're probably here to see my presentation on the demo scene, so let's get straight to that. All right, hello everybody in the Chicago area. Thank you for coming to see my little presentation here. Some of this may not be news to all of you, but this will be going on my channel eventually. So, as most of y'all have gathered, and yes, I'm from Texas, so I can say y'all. All right, so I'm going to be talking about the demo scene, what it is, why people make them, why people like to watch them. It's going to be very heavily Commodore focused, but obviously demos are on like pretty much every platform out there. We even have some demo coders in this audience, like Jim Leonard over here, for example. So, you know, if I showed this to the average, typical person, they'd probably look at something like this and they'd go, well, I mean, I guess that kind of looks neat, but why should I get excited about that? I see stuff like this on a cheap insurance commercial, you know, all the time. That looks way better than that, you know. So, so in order to really appreciate a demo, you kind of have to know something about the hardware it's running on, because you can't really appreciate a demo unless you know what the limitations are of the system that it's been designed for. And this is a kind of a modern demo here for the C64. Actually, well, I say modern, this came out several years ago. It was still one of my favorite. And one of the things I like to compare demos to is a magic show. If you're watching a magic show, the magician's going to get up on stage and he's going to do all kinds of things that you're going to be like, wow, that shouldn't even be possible. That breaks the laws of physics. And so that's why you get excited about it, because you're like, you want to know, how did he do that? I like to compare it to, for those who haven't seen it, Penn and Teller's Fool Us show. So if you're not familiar with that, what they have is they have guest magicians that get up on stage and they perform these acts and they try to see if they can fool Penn and Teller, so that Penn and Teller, usually they'll figure out, okay, yeah, I know how they're doing that, but sometimes they can't figure it out. That's what really blows me away about a demo, is when somebody can write one, because most of the time I'm going to watch that demo and I'm going to go, okay, they're moving this register, they're changing that sprite, I know how they're doing that, but sometimes I'll watch a demo and I'm like, I have no idea how they're doing this. This shouldn't even be possible, and yet they're doing it. And that's what makes the demo scene so cool, is when people can do stuff that's just mind-blowing like that. So I wanted to show you 5 reasons that at least I know of. There's probably more, but at least 5 reasons why people would write a demo. One reason, of course, would be to sell a product. So like a computer company or a game company would write a demo either to sell their game. In fact, you might even think of like shareware as a type of demo in many ways. But also like to sell a computer or to sell a game console or something like that. That's one reason to make a demo. Another word, a common reason, particularly back in the 80s, was just for bragging rights. Say, hey guys, look what I was able to do with my skill. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. Another reason for making demo would be for competitions. They actually have competitions all around the world, particularly like in Helsinki, Finland, like the assembly competition they have there, where people literally make demos to compete to see who can win the prize for making the coolest demo. So there's that reason. To show off your platform. So particularly back in the 80s, you know, there was always this competition between like, which is the best system, you know, Atari, Apple, Commodore, you know, whatever. So people wanted to show off their computer. So they would write a demo for, say, a Commodore 64, and they'd be like, let's see if your Apple II can do that. You know, that kind of thing, to, you know, show off your favorite platform. that's one reason for writing a demo. And then, of course, some people write them just to tell a story. And so I'm going to show you some vintage demos here in a little bit that kind of fall under all of these different categories. And any of you Commodore guys out there are going to definitely recognize some of these. The first one, of course, being the Commodore Christmas demo. So this was included with or used to sell Commodore machines back in the early 80s, like 1982. This was one of the first ever demos actually written for Commodore systems, and it was written by Commodore themselves. So this falls under that category of I want to sell a product. I actually remember seeing this running on systems when I would walk into like Sears and whatnot. I would see this running on Commodore systems, and well, it's not going to knock your socks off or anything in terms of graphics and sound. It was pretty cool back then, and I guess it worked for what it was designed for. I think a lot of the demo scene actually evolved from the cracking scene, or from crack-tros, or as we call them, crack intros. And for those that aren't familiar, a lot of your original software was copy protected. So the game publishers would put software on the disk to check to see if it was a duplicate, and if it was, then the game wouldn't run. And so what these crackers would do is they would go look through the code and see if they could find that particular piece of code for the copy protection scheme and either remove it or disable it. And that would make the game possible to copy and then copy it again, and so on and so forth. A lot of the times these crackers would put their own little intros in front of the game, and I'm going to show you a few. This is a real early one here. This is from Pitfall 2, and it just says Berlin Cracking Service. Doesn't say a whole lot, just a little still picture there. And then after a few seconds, there you go, your game starts. So that's a really, really early cracktro. But they got a little bit more sophisticated as time went by. So this is a few years later. This is one in front of SimCity, and this is by some people called Duet. A little bit more fancy. They got a little scroller message and some stuff like that. And then SimCity would load up. This next one here is from Battle Chess. Now you notice they've really got the effects going here, and they've even got like a musical track going in the background. And as you can see, these cracktros are getting more and more impressive. We'll skip ahead a few more years. This is from Lemmings. And they have really just gone all out on this one. So they probably didn't care much about people with epilepsy, but they got a lot of flashing stuff. They got a musical thing going in the background. But yeah, I think some of these guys that did these crack intros, I guess they ran out of stuff to crack, and they're like, I just want to write demo code. And so that kind of, I think, transitioned some into the demo scene. Anyway, here's an older demo. This is called Swinth, or I think it went by some other names as well. And it's not visually all that impressive. It's just a little kaleidoscope. But everybody that ran this ran it just to listen to the music. This had some really fantastic music. It has like 8 songs. I used to listen to this when I was doing my homework in junior high or reading a book or whatever. It was just a really fantastic piece of music that they have going on here. This next one's kind of the same way. They've got they've got a neat little concert thing going on here, but ultimately everybody that played this wanted to hear the music from Rob Hubbard. That's what this boiled down to. This particular demo went by several different names. I know it was Drum Man Demo, Trap Demo, a few different things. There's various variations of this demo out there. This particular one has been modified up to be an advertisement, so it's selling a product. So it's distributed around on BBSs, and this is advertising CompuNet, I think. But it actually tells a story, like in this little window here. It goes on for like 10 or 15 minutes, and I'll skip forward just a bit, but there's like this whole story of a little UFO man and a nuclear war, and all this stuff happens, and obviously we don't have time to watch the whole thing, but it's pretty neat just to watch the whole story unfold. So that's another type of demo. Again, this is pretty early 80s when this one came out. Then there's this guy. This is the Juggler Demo, although it's also been called Bubbles and a few other things depending on where you downloaded it from. This is an interesting thing because it's actually in response to an Amiga demo, which some of you may recognize, which was the Juggler Demo. So I remember going into stores and seeing this running on Amiga 500s back in the 80s. And it was actually pretty amazing by that day's standards because it's ray traced graphics and it's really smooth animation and all that. And this is one of those things where I'm pretty sure somebody saw this and like, I bet we could do this on the C64. And so that's exactly what they did. And, you know, it doesn't look quite as good as the Amiga version, but hey, it's pretty close. Anyway, moving along. Here's a demo that showed off some digitized graphics and sound. Now, this demo I remember specifically because I used to have arguments with a guy in junior high who had an Apple II, and he was always telling me how my Commodore 64 was crap. And I would always try to tell him some of the things that my Commodore 64 could do because I knew what the Apples could do. We had those in school. And one day I brought him over to my house and I showed him this demo, and he never called my Commodore 64 crap again. Again, these are all vintage demos. Now, the thing about all these demos I've just shown is none of these demos are really doing anything that seems impossible. Like, we all knew how all of these demos worked. So there's various different ways that you can break the rules, so to speak, doing things that do seem impossible. And I want to talk about some of those, starting with raster interrupts. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually close this. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about is raster interrupts, and I'm going to give you a really, really cheesy example of a raster interrupt, but for those that don't know how they work, I think this will be extremely enlightening. So everybody that had a Commodore 64 is probably familiar with this particular command. You can type this command to change the border color on the Commodore 64. There's exactly one register in memory, and you can put any number between 0 and 15 in there. So there's 16 different combinations. And so everybody knew that you could do this. And one time when I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, I picked up a magazine in a store, and it had some type-in programs. And one of these programs was saying that it would put more than one color on the border. And I was pretty intrigued by that, so I took the magazine home and I typed the program in. It was a machine language program, so I had no idea how it worked, but I just typed it in, and it worked. Now, I'd have lost that program, so I have no idea where it is, but I wrote one that's basically does the same thing. And so when I saw this, when I was 8 or 9 years old, my mind was absolutely blown because I'm like, this doesn't make sense. There's only one register to put a color in. How can you put multiple colors in for the border? Of course, what I didn't realize at the time is they were using raster interrupts to do this, and the way that works, of course, is the screen is not all drawn exactly at the same time. It starts at the top, draws it all the way down. So all you have to do is with some careful timing, you can draw the screen part way, change the border, draw a little bit more, change the border, and you just do this all the way down. You could literally put a different color for every single line of the border if you wanted to. And so it's all about timing. And again, as an 8-year-old, I couldn't comprehend this, but this is an example of doing something that doesn't seem possible until it's explained, of course. Now, you can use raster interrupts for things that are way more complex than changing the border. And I'm going to give you another example. Now, I didn't write this one, but now this little demo here, what it's doing that looks impossible for those familiar with the C64 is there's way more than 8 sprites on the screen. Everything advertised about the Commodore 64 is it has 8 sprites. Yet there's 24, I counted last night, I think there's 24 sprites on the screen here. And again, they're using raster interrupts to do this, so they'll draw a sprite at the top of the screen, and then as the raster goes down, they'll move the sprite to another part of the screen, and then it'll do it again a third time down at the bottom of the screen, and they can actually produce way more than 8 sprites. So the first time I saw a demo, probably back in the late 80s, that had multiple, like 16 sprites on the screen, I was looking at that going, oh my God, how are they doing this? This is impossible. And of course, now I know how they're doing it. This demo is breaking another rule too. Raise your hand if you recognize what it is. Only Thomas noticed. They're drawing in the borders, the screen borders at the top and bottom. That should also be impossible. And there's various other tricks you can do to accomplish that as well. So this is an interesting little demo that breaks the rules. So now I want to talk about speed code. I'm going to write a small little assembly language program here for you guys. Now, it doesn't matter if you don't understand assembly language. It's only going to have 2 commands, so it's going to be really easy to understand. I'm going to assemble some code at C1000, and it's going to increase the border color by 1. So that's what that command does. And then the very next command is just going to jump back to C1000 in an infinite loop over and over again. It's kind of interesting. I think everybody that's ever programmed any assembly language on the C64 will probably have written this piece of code before. Pretty simple, 2 little commands, and it's changing the border so fast that it just becomes like a jumble of colors. Now here's where I want to talk about speed code. How do you think I could make this run even faster? Like if I were writing a demo and I needed this to run even faster, you'd look at this piece of code and you say, well, it's only 2 lines and you need both of those. This is really what you would call irreducible complexity. I mean, you can't simplify this anymore. How could you possibly make it run faster? Well, believe it or not, you can. And this is just a very primitive example, but it's going to serve to prove the point. So I'm going to write the code again, and I'm going to also increase DO20. Now the thing is, that second command, that jump command, actually consumes some CPU power. Like it's like probably, I think, 3 cycles or something like that it consumes to jump back up to complete the loop. So what if we just didn't use the jump command at all, and we just kept doing the same command over and over again? Now this makes it very inefficient from a standpoint of how much memory you're consuming or how tight the code is. Now you'll eventually need the jump at some point. So I just made the code much bigger, but now it runs almost twice as fast. And you can see the pattern looks a little bit different. Now this is obviously an extremely primitive example, but I use this type of thing even in Pesky Robots sometimes to get some particular features to run faster. And it's called unrolling a loop, basically is what it's called. So you're making the code less efficient in one way, but improving the efficiency in another way. So that's an example of speed code, and this kind of stuff is used in demos all the time, and some of them can be dramatically bigger. Like they could take a piece of code that might normally be 20 bytes and turn it into 200 or 300 bytes if need be in order to get it to run a little faster. So that's another type of trick that they do in demos. When you see something, you're like, how do they get that to run that fast? So that's a type of thing. The next thing I want to show you is, this will be the last little trick I'm going to show you, uncovering the magician's secrets here. Believe me, there's way more than this, but I'm just showing 3 examples today because they're pretty easy to understand. This little program doesn't do a lot. It's a little program I wrote in BASIC, and it just shows 5 shades of gray. If you include black and white, 5 shades of gray. These are the only shades of gray that the Commodore 64 can produce. It only has 16 color palette. The 16 colors are not modifiable. You can't change them to anything else. They're set in stone. And yet there's some demos out there that appear to have more than the basic 16 colors that the C64 can produce. And so, how would you do that? Well, this is a little basic program that it's really primitive, but it's just to kind of illustrate the results. I've got a little end statement in here, and I'm going to take that out. And so what it's going to do is it's going to alternate between 2 different things. And as you can see, it's kind of flickery, but it kind of looks like there's 9 shades of gray up there now, doesn't it? Now, this is running in BASIC. This is as fast as it can go. But if you write this in assembly language, you can literally do it 60 times a second, 1 for every field. You can literally alternate the colors. And if it's on a real CRT, which, by the way, I don't think there's any way I could emulate this here because the refresh rates and stuff are not going to match up on the modern hardware. But if you had a real C64 and a real CRT monitor, you can mix colors using this technique. And I'm going to show you some examples of these are just still pictures, and again, for the purposes of watching online. So this is an example of a demo that was made just a few years ago. It's called Dreamtime. And they are mixing 2 screens together. And of course, we're not going to see, if you had a real C64 here, it would be flickering just a little bit, but it would not be very noticeable. And this looks like stuff that you would see like on an Amiga, like on a 16-bit type machine. But this is actually from a Commodore 64. And what they're actually doing to generate these images is they literally have 2 different screens. And they're just flipping a register back and forth 60 times a second to alternate the 2 screens. And each screen is slightly different so that when they're overlaid, they mix the colors. And some of this stuff looks like really impressive. Like, you just wouldn't imagine seeing this on a C64. They're also breaking another rule, I think. I think they're using raster interrupts to break the color cell rule, right? Because you've got these little color cells of 8 by 8 pixels, and you can only have 2 colors in each cell. But if every raster line, you change what the color cell's values are, you can put more than 2 colors in an 8 by 8 pixel cell. So I think they're doing that in combination with mixing. Now, one of the questions that people always ask is they want to know, well, if you can do amazing stuff like this on a Commodore 64 with graphics that look like this, why don't the games look that way? Well, the trouble is, of course, like this picture here I'm showing you, if it were running on the real hardware, it would be consuming pretty much all of the memory in the computer. And it would be using almost all of the CPU power to display it. So there really isn't any memory left for a game or any CPU time left to run any game logic for that kind of thing. So a lot of these demo scenes that you see that are like super, super impressive, it's one thing to put them in a demo where you're just kind of showing one effect on the screen. But when you try to start making a game out of that kind of thing, it's usually just not feasible. So to answer that question, I have one more demo I want to show. I told you about people writing demos to tell a story. And I have no idea who this guy is. But he wrote this demo about me. And the face, the caricature actually is pretty accurate, but I actually don't own any boots or pants or shirts that look like that. Anyway, I just thought you guys might find that funny. It was a very short little demo, but it obviously tells a story. So, anyway, so yeah, I think that wraps up the main portion. So now I will take any questions. They don't necessarily have to be about the demo scene, but I will try to answer if they do.
I have a wireless mic here, so.
Oh yeah, because you're talking about like making code faster. Is it possible to like overclock something like a Commodore 64 to achieve some of that?
Not really. The Commodore 64, among some of the other 8-bit machines, the clock signal is tied into like 8 different things in the machine, and so you can't like increase the clock of one thing without increasing the clock of everything, which includes the video chip and its timing for creating a video display. So yeah, unfortunately, I mean, there are ways to do it. There was like a cartridge for the C64, I think, that could give it 16 megahertz, but it's so ridiculously difficult to do that. Generally speaking, it's almost like replacing the whole hardware in the computer. So yeah, that was one of the limitations of some of these 8-bit architectures. That's why the MS-DOS machines with their architecture was actually easier for them to increase the CPU speed while keeping the bus and everything else, running at its own clock speeds.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the demos, are they usually a sole author or a team
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
The demos, are they usually a sole author or a team of people, delegated to the music and effects and so forth?
Oh, it just really depends. Some of the simpler demos, like the one I showed with the little balls moving around on the screen, I think that was one guy that did that. But some of the more, most of the really complex demos you see are usually made by entire teams. You'll have one guy doing the artwork, one guy doing the music, multiple guys doing coding, almost just like a video game in that regard. Yeah.
Maybe similar. Where do you learn this? Do you have to learn it from someone, or is there an instruction manual that like you just have to study to learn the tricks?
I get asked that a lot, and I honestly have never had a good answer. I started learning this stuff when I was like 12, just by talking to people, reading things posted on BBSs and eventually books and stuff like that. So yeah, if somebody wanted to start from scratch today, I just honestly have no idea where to tell them to go, other than if it's for the Commodore, they could get the Programmer's Reference Guide, which is pretty good. But I don't know. There's a lot of YouTube videos out there covering stuff like this as well. Some of them are kind of dry and long and boring. And I'm not blaming the authors for that. I couldn't make videos about that kind of stuff without being dry and long and boring either. But there are some videos out there on that kind of thing. Yeah.
What was the program you were using to emulate the C64 on there?
Here, I'm using the Vice emulator. It's probably the most popular one out there. It runs on Linux, Mac, Windows, just about everything. Yeah.
So the color bars on the side of the screen, when some programs are loading, is that like a status thing? So if it gets stuck somewhere, the border will be one color, and they might have like a cheat sheet to see where it got stuck?
Yeah, a lot of 8-bit machines did that, even like when they were loading from cassette or just when things were decompressing. And it's just kind of to give the user some feedback that, hey, the computer's not locked up. We're really doing something here. And on a modern computer, you'd probably put like a message or something telling them what's going on with the status bar or something. But that all takes extra RAM and extra time to code it. So a lot of coders back then, there's like, hey, you know what? We can update the border. It takes one instruction to like increase the border value. That's like a real easy thing they can just throw in there just to add some kind of feedback for just to see that, hey, something's working here. Just wait. Yeah, that was a real common thing.
You have a video series about the history of Commodore. I was wondering when the next video on the Amiga would be coming out.
Yeah, you and about 10 million other people. Yeah, that video, I've started that video about 8 times now, and then it always gets pushed to the back burner because it's going to be a really long video. It's going to be really hard to make. I've got some of it scripted, some stuff already made on it, and it's just one of those things that I literally need like 6 weeks to set aside to make that video, and every time I start working on it, it just, something happens. I'm like, I just got to push this back, and that's been happening now for like 2 years now. But I'm going to get to it eventually.
I don't really have a question per se. I just want to say thanks for all of your videos and putting content out there for retro computing and retro
thank you.
gaming. And yeah, it's been a kind of an inspiration for me personally. I do games and stuff on the side, and what you're doing is way beyond what I could ever do, but it's fun to watch and inspiring, so thank you.
Yes. Are you familiar with what cosplay is?
Am I familiar with what?
Cosplay.
Child's play?
Cosplay.
I'm sorry, it's cosplay.
Yeah, dressing up as characters.
Yeah, I'm familiar with cosplay,
Could you be
of course.
persuaded to dress up as Captain Picard? I think you would be a good fit.
I think everybody else can hear you but me. I just, because the speakers are facing this way, so I just, what did he say?
That you would be a good replacement for Captain Picard.
Oh, well, that's quite a compliment, I guess. I need to shave the rest of my head, though, to match up. Make it so. Yeah. All right, well, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of other... Oh.
Do you know if there's a collection of all the demos or the most famous ones in one place?
Somebody said something. There's a variety of places you can go. CSDB is probably a good place. POUET.net. Demo Central, he says. There you go. All right. Well, obviously, you guys can always come ask me questions. I'm going to be at the booth for the next day and a half. So if y'all, we'll get one more over here, and then we'll dismiss everybody and yeah.
So you pointed out here a lot of the stuff is for like the 8 and 16-bit machines. There is some stuff for newer hardware. Like I'm sure there's some like PlayStation and 64 era demos. Are you worried that this scene is going to be kind of stuck in the 8-bit era? Do you think it'll move forward? Do you think people will lose interest as those computers continue to get older? Or
well, I suppose that's always possible, but there's always, once you start getting into like the 32-bit machines, how should we put this? The same is true for games. Like, back in the early 80s, one person could write a game. Maybe 3 or 4 people could write a game. Now you need a whole team and like millions of dollars of budget and all that to write, good games for these 32-bit systems because what people's expectations are. So I think there's always going to be a place for, especially with demos, writing for the really limited hardware because it's something that one guy can do in his spare time when he's interested. And there's also the challenge, of course, and that's what a lot of people do it for these days is the challenge. how much can I squeeze into very little? I mean, there's people out there still writing demos for the Atari 2600, so so yeah, I think there'll always be demos for the 8-bit systems just because of their nature.
I was curious. I grew up watching these demos also for my old Amiga, and you mentioned like breaking the rules. I loved the demos that broke the rules. I was wondering about the X16. If there are any demos so far that anyone's made, and if they break any rules on the X16 yet.
I don't think anybody's figured out anything yet because we don't have the hardware in the hands of some of those talented folks. But I would imagine in time, someone will probably figure out ways to do things on that machine that we, as designers, didn't even think of. Well, look, guys, I'm gonna wrap it up here. But like I said, I'm gonna be at my booth after lunch and then all day tomorrow too. So if you got any more questions for me, come by and say hi. So.